Hello and welcome to the next lesson in Soviet School of Chess. We are still talking about the general tactics and strategy, and we are in the topic of the restriction of mobility, and today we'll talk about pin. So how a pinned piece has a restricted mobility and how you can restrict the mobility of the piece by using pin. Before we go to some concrete examples, let's first define what is a pin. And when we talk about pin, we talk about absolute and relative pin. So here in this position, you can say that the knight is in absolute pin. This means that this knight cannot be moved, and it cannot be moved because the rules of chess permits him to move. So when the piece is pinned to the king, then it's called absolute pin, because this piece absolutely cannot move. On the other hand, you have something called relative pin. So for example, this position here. So this knight is in relative pin. This means that this knight can move. The rules of chess allow the knight to move, but if the knight moves, black will lose the queen. White can just capture the queen. And here you have to be careful because sometimes the move with knight can be a good move. It can be check, it can be attack on the queen, it can create some threats. So be careful when you have the piece in relative pin. This piece is movable. So it's not like an absolute pin that you cannot move it, by the rules of chess. So you have to be careful when you are in the relative pin. Okay, so let's see some concrete examples how pin can be utilized in the game. So this is the first example. This is a very famous and very common pattern. So you can see immediately that this pawn on g7 is under absolute pin. So this pawn cannot move. And this allows white to play queen takes h6 check, and after king moves, queen g7 checkmate. So exploiting the pin. Let's look at another example. In this position, you can see that this bishop on g7 is in the pin, and this is absolute pin. So this means that if you attack this bishop cannot move. So in this position, the winning move is just f6, attacking the bishop, and the bishop cannot move, and white will win the bishop and the game. Okay, let's see another example. So here it's a little bit more complicated, but the first thing you have to notice is that there is absolute pin on this pawn on b7. So if you notice that the piece is in the absolute pin, you need to ask yourself what role does this piece perform in the position, because this piece cannot move. So if you are focused on this b7 pawn, you can see that the b7 pawn is protecting c6 pawn, and still it is pinned, then this c6 pawn is unprotected. So if you notice this, then you can easily see mate in 3 here, begins with knight takes c6 with a check, king has to move to a8, and now this pawn is no longer pinned because king moved, so this pawn is no longer pinned, but this pawn is obstructing the access to a7 square. So if this pawn is not here, then this would be a mate. So this is one of the mating patterns you should know and recognize in order to solve this puzzle. So all you need to do is to remove this pawn, and the mate will follow. So rook to a6 is check, and after the pawn takes rook, rook to a7 is mate. So this is also a very famous example, a very famous pattern of king being in the corner, and then rook delivers checkmate with the help of the knight. Okay, let's go to the next example. Here you can also notice the absolute pin. So this bishop on g6 is under absolute pin, but you have to calculate a little bit how to exploit this situation. So for example, if you start just by taking the bishop, this will lose the draw. So if you take the bishop, he takes the rook, takes, and now this is a draw. So it's not straightforward how to exploit this pin, but if you calculate a little bit more, then you can see that you can take the rook, and after he takes back with the rook will be in the absolute pin, and then you can challenge and attack the rook with the pawn. So this is the correct combination. So rook takes first, and after rook takes back, now rook is in the absolute pin, and there is a very nice opportunity to attack the rook just by playing h5. And now the rook is gone, and white will go on and win the game. A very famous example about how you should be careful when there is a relative pin involved is a so-called legal mate. And there are many different variations in which this legal mate occurs. This is the historical game in which it occurred first. So I'll just play it. e4, e5, this is how it went. Bishop c4, d6, knight f3, so just normal development, knight c6, knight c3, bishop g4. Now bishop g4 is pinning the knight, but this pin is a relative pin, so knight can move. And here it did, white played knight takes e5. And this is a blunder because, you know, if black just takes back the knight with the knight, then the knight will protect the bishop and everything will be fine. Of course, if he takes with something else, for example, if he takes with the pawn, then white can just take the piece and the white will be a pawn up. But yeah, this knight takes refuse the whole combination. But here white was playing for a trap, which is not the correct way of playing. You should not be playing for a trap in a way that you know, puts you in danger. So this is not a correct way to play, but it's a good example how greed can you know, darken one's mind. So after this move, black thought that well, white just blundered the queen, so he took the queen. And now famous legal mate begins with bishop takes f7 check, king has to move to e7, and then knight d5 checkmate. Like I said, there are variations of this legal mate in which knight e5 is actually a good move, a winning move. So for example, if the knight wasn't here, then yeah, this would be a move which either delivers checkmate or wins a pawn. So it's a useful pattern to know. And also useful reminder that relative pin is not absolute pin. Okay, let's move to the next example. This position is a little bit complicated, but if you look at it, you can see some common motifs here. So, for example, this pawn is a weak pawn. White has the problem defending this pawn, and also black has this a pawn which could be strong, or at least it's you know, stopping the other b pawn from promoting. So what white wants to do here is to somehow exchange this pawn for this pawn. And if white manages to exchange this pawn for this pawn, since white is a pawn up, he will have a passed b pawn, and this will give him some winning chances. So this is how you should think about the positions. You want to exchange these two pawns and then promote this pawn. So white was thinking about this, and he played the move b7. And now this b7 move exploits some pins in the position. So for example, if black decides to take the pawn with his bishop, then bishop to a6 could be played, and now the bishop cannot be recaptured because this bishop is pinned to the black rook. So this is a relative pin, but yeah, he doesn't want to take. So what can black do in this position? He can go on and play king to c7, you know, protecting the rook, and now this pin, I mean, now this bishop is no longer pinned because if bishop takes, well, the rook is protected, so it's not a problem. But white can here just go on and exchange everything and go to the winning endgame. So rook takes b7 check, rook takes, and now you can see that white is clearly winning because he has a passed pawn, he's a pawn up, and he just needs, you know, to bring his king and to promote. It should be a very easy game for white. Let's see what else can black do here. If he takes with the rook, well, this is now a disaster because of the following combination. So rook can go to c3 delivering check, and also, you know, once the king moves, the bishop is attacked. So if king moves to d7 trying to protect the bishop, then this bishop to h3, you know, is check, and after this the bishop will be attacked twice, and black would just lose the piece. So this is why here after b7 black decides to play bishop to e6, but now white can just take a6 pawn, threatening maybe to give a check and then go to c8. So king went to c7 trying to protect the rook, and now rook c3 check, king goes to b6, and now rook c8. And now, of course, if black takes with the bishop, then it's game over. White will just be upper piece. So after rook to c8, the only defense is here is actually to play king to a7, you know, protecting the rook. But now you can see that all black pieces are tied down. King is here forever, rook is here forever. So now white has all the time in the world just, you know, to bring up his king and try to break here on the queen side. And eventually white will just, you know, capture all black pawns with the king and promote on the queen side, since all the black pieces are tied on the king side. Okay, let's go to the next example. So in this position you can notice that black rook is attacking white queen. So this is the main motif, the main problem for white here, how to solve this attack. But also you can see some opportunities, you know, some mating threats, maybe here if the rook wasn't there, and also some pins, which will white exploit. So white here played rook to f8, and now rook cannot take the queen because of the absolute pin. And if rook takes rook, then here is the checkmate. So this here is a very nice move, exploiting the pin and exploiting the checkmate threat. So there are two ways to defend against checkmate, and both are with the knight. So one is knight to e8, you know, defending this square, or knight to f5, again defending this square. So let's see what happens if he plays knight to e8. Well, then rook can just take the knight, and now rook cannot take the rook because of the checkmate, so queen has to take the rook, and now this queen f7 is very nice move with the check. The only way is to block, and then it is a checkmate. So this is why this knight to e8 doesn't work. So black played alternative knight to f5, you know, protecting against the mate. But now rook takes g8 with the check. The only move is now queen takes g8, and now queen takes knight. Black queen takes bishop, and now queen f8 wins the game. And in this position black resigned because the only defense is queen g8 to block the check, but then queen f6 check, queen has to block, and this is a checkmate. So you can see here how white managed to exploit both the pin and the checkmating opportunity. Okay, let's see the next example. So here you can immediately notice that g2 pawn is pinned. So there are some, you know, opportunities maybe to exploit this pin. This means that this pawn doesn't cover these two squares. So, for example, this square is available for the knight. This game was played between Ove and Keres in the World Championship in 1948, and both players were in great time trouble. So they didn't find the best continuations here. But nevertheless, black managed to find a very nice move which wins the piece, and this is rook takes c1. And now you can see that white cannot recapture, because of course if he takes with the queen, then here is just checkmate, and if he takes with the rook, well, then black can exploit this pin by playing knight to f3 and forking king and the queen, and of course knight cannot be captured because the pawn is pinned. So this is what Keres managed to find in just a few seconds, just opportunity to win the piece. So rook takes c1 is played, and now h3 is played. So Ove didn't take, and now being in time trouble, Keres immediately played queen to g3. And okay, I mean this is still a winning game, and Keres went on and win the game in the 56th move, but there was a much quicker win, and this quicker win is exploiting the pin of the pawn. So knight to f3 check is a winning move, because you can see not only that this pawn is pinned, but also this rook is pinned. So you have a double pin of both rook and the pawn. So this knight here cannot be captured. And now what to do? I mean, the only move which avoids mate, if king goes to h1, then it's just a checkmate. So the only move which avoids mate is rook to f2. And now if you just take the rook, king takes back, and now you can take the queen with the check. So white has no time to capture the queen. And this is the, of course, very easy and very quick win. Okay, and let's look at the last chapter for today. This is also from the real game. So here you can notice some interesting pins. So first of all, you can see that there is also kind of double pin. So the queen is in relative pin, and these pawns are in the absolute pin. So if this pawn moves, ever moves, then white can just take the queen, and black cannot recapture because this pawn is pinned. So there is this double pin motif. And this is what white exploits by playing rook to b3. And now, I mean, black resigned here in the game, because if black takes the rook, then white can just take the queen, and this pawn is pinned. So there is no capturing back, and black is just down a queen for a rook, and this is a losing position. Or alternatively, black can step away with the queen, so for example queen a5, but now there is a striking blow, queen to b7 check, and after king moves, then rook to b7 check, and this is a catastrophe. Black is losing the queen and is getting checkmated in several moves. Okay, so this was the last example for today. I hope you liked the lesson. We talked about restricting the mobility of the pieces using the pin. So I hope you can learn something from these examples and maybe hopefully apply them in your games. Thanks for watching, stay tuned, new lessons are coming, and see you soon. Cheers.